1, 2, 3. Close enough.
Do you want me to do it again? I was
No.
before you.
No, that's fine. I'll be able to get it close enough at least. Okay, sorry. So let's start over. Hello and welcome to Matters of Engagement, a podcast exploring the complex world of patient engagement and partnership. I'm Jennifer Johannesson.
And I'm Emily Nicholas Angle.
It'll be another week or so until we release our next scheduled episode, so we thought this would be a perfect opportunity to give listeners a bit of insight into how we approach making this podcast. This is our unscripted but lightly edited conversation about everything from interviewing guests to how we think about scripting and editing to why we love working together on this podcast. We started by talking about how every episode is unique, and things just rolled from there. Yeah, there's a lot of components to consider. I mean, first and foremost, of course, I think the first thing I think of is the guest themselves. You know, what sort of position do they have in the field, and who are they? Who are they to others? Who are they in their own minds? You know, and are we inviting them on as a kind of critical commentator? Are we inviting them on as a kind of example of something that happens out in the world? And so that shifts how we think about them and how we want to script things. So there's that piece, but then you're right, there's also the topics we've already covered. What do we think is already out there in terms of content, and what have our listeners already heard in other forums, and is this even interesting? Are we just contributing to the pile of stuff that's already been mused over? So yeah, it's all intertwined, and I can't imagine we would come up with some perfect formula.
One thing that struck me is that I obviously have some ideas in my head that sort of float around a lot. And I think one of the things is when I hear someone speaking, not to be already thinking of those things, because what I found is it's really shaped some of my ideas or taken me a step back or something with some of the guests where, you know, I have to fight that urge to be like, but don't you think this? Or after they've spoken to kind of say, yeah, like I think that underlines this, and to say, no, like step all of that aside. What did they say? It's the sort of thing I wake up in the night about, wondering if we've done justice to what they said and not inserted ourselves too much or made it too much about things that I already was thinking. That really weighs on me.
Mm-hmm. Well, it also it's a even if it didn't weigh on you, it would still be a hard balance to strike. When we're in the interviews and we're talking to people, we're not just having a conversation. We're also thinking about how to shape the episode. We're thinking about all the conversations you and I had prior to talking to them. And we may have even had a pre-conversation with the person that we're now recording and interviewing. So there's so much context for the conversation that it's almost impossible to just, you know, be naive, you know, and just chat, because we've got so much else going on. But I would say it's partly that, yeah, it's the wearing of the different hats, that because we have to be listening for different things at the same time while we're talking. And I'm so glad that the two of us actually do the interviews, because there's times when it's not that I'm tuning out, but I'm tracking a different thought while the person is still talking. And so I may have lost some of what they've said. So when we listen back to interviews, I'm like, oh, wow, they said something really interesting there. And I'm glad Emily was listening to pick up on it.
It just speaks to the subjective nature of this stuff. I'll hear something and I'll be like, you know, when they said that and they were saying about how this, and you'll say, no, I don't think that's what they were saying at all. I think they were saying this. And then we really have to dig into exactly what they were saying. And that really helps, because I find what it does is it stops me where it's necessary to stop in terms of assumptions a little bit better. One struggle, I think, with this format is that we do the interview, but we don't just play the interview. We do this extra bit on the end, which means we've removed that person from the ability to like comment on that or just to be part of that conversation. And I think it works in its own way, but it does add a different onus and a different level of scrutiny, I think, or consideration that, you know, obviously if we just designed the questions for the interview and then did the interview and played it as our podcast, we wouldn't have to consider.
Mm-hmm. I think the other piece that gets tricky is you and I pore over the transcript. And these are words that are spoken temporally or whatever, like they're in a moment in time, and we're not necessarily scripted by the other person. And so the things that they say, they may not want to, live and die by the one thing they said that one time. And you and I are trying to extract meaning from these spoken words of somebody who maybe, they were maybe speaking off the cuff and wouldn't necessarily want to be held to the words that they said. So, I mean, we're obviously trying to figure that out by letting people now hear what we've recorded before we carry on, so that they can, have the option to take out pieces that they may have said or reflect on them differently. So that's a good learning. But I still find that there's risk there in catching somebody out inadvertently when, we're trying to extract meaning from what they said, and yet they maybe didn't think that hard about it.
And I think it's been a lesson for me in speaking on the record. Because I think most of us don't have much experience with that unless we're constantly being interviewed for things or whatever, is the fact that, what came out of your mouth is what you said. So people are going to use it as what you said and what you meant. That's really tricky, because it's true. There's probably lots of stuff that we all say that genuinely is not what we meant. And so I think it's been a good lesson for me to be more considerate. You wouldn't know by my talking, but I am learning. Should have heard me before I started the podcast.
Well, I think one of the things that will help in the future that we're still working on is trying to get clear on what our own agenda is. Because I think up until now, we've been, earnestly just interviewing people around certain topics or something that they've written or something we think, they would have some interesting comments on. But it's rarely about the person. Like there's few celebrities, in the patient engagement world. So it's more about people who have a particular vantage point or perspective or an expertise. And we want to hear what those words are and that person themselves. We're not trying to elevate them. So I guess what I'm saying is playing a full-length interview where it's just the world according to the guest. It doesn't quite satisfy, I think, what you and I want to construct in an episode, and yet we haven't really come out and declared what it is we're trying to construct in an episode. Or, nor do we really tell the person because we don't really know yet until after we've talked to them what it's going to be. So I think once we get a little clearer on an overall editorial statement, which I think we're kind of constructing as we go, like it's getting clearer every time how we negotiate topics, how we negotiate guests, or navigate rather, like those sorts of things. But I don't think it's terribly obvious to the listeners what that agenda actually is. I am clear, I think, that I come from a critical point of view, and not just because I'm like inherently pessimistic. I mean, I am, but I also feel like in this field, somebody has to hold space for that. And that doesn't mean I don't see some of the things that other people are saying about, what they get out of it and why it's meaningful to them. And I think that's a part of my growth over the past little while is now that I've encountered people in a much more intimate way, I can see just how passionate people are and how their identities are connected to the work that they do in engagement. So I feel like I've developed more empathy around that and more curiosity as opposed to just wanting to take the whole thing down. And yet, at the same time, I personally have a bit of a mission of speaking truth to power. And I feel like even though there are good people doing good things, I'm not necessarily wanting to like call them pawns in somebody else's evil game. I think there's nothing helped by that, but I'm not going to include any of this. But I feel like that is the case, actually, that there's a machine at work. And even if we can't escape it, I think it's important to hold space for calling, to naming it and talking about it.
I felt like when I started in engagement work, I felt really solid in this kind of concept or the logic of experience of healthcare and the way people experience it and what happens outside of, clinical research and these things. is really relevant to making good care. But I had no concept of engagement. Shalom Gluberman, who was the first person I met, was sort of talking about this idea of not advocacy, but having people working with other healthcare providers to kind of share experience and shape things. It resonated for me in terms of the logic of having a system which wasn't just based on like, fix you, now you're fixed, now you go home. And I think when I started, I felt like good about it. I was like, yeah, like let's get these voices, let's get these experiences included without much thought about what that would really mean or presuppositions. And then it sort of happened. And then it all just got built, and it was in research and it was in institutions, and there was like engagement, this, that, and the other. And I was in it. And I don't think I thought, as much about it as I could have, but also it was just going so fast, and I was doing a lot of work in various, and so I think I really had a bit of like a point where I'm like, I don't know if I can just do this without criticizing it, because where does that happen? The logic that I felt was there didn't uphold all that was going on. My somewhat agenda for coming here was just trying to understand it for myself, and also feeling kind of like a moral imperative to be like, if I'm going to do this work, like I better be able to speak that I understand why I'm doing it or know what's going on. And also just that I was really disheartened by how few places I could go to read stuff like yours or to find conversations like I'd had with you. And it felt like for me, the agenda was sort of like, well, let's have it happen a little bit more broadly, or like, can we do this in a bit more of a structured way? Have others included more? And also I was curious with so many other people, whether they were willing to go there. There's something here, like I don't even know yet what it's going to be or what I'm trying to understand, because the more I talk to people, the more it feels a bit like a moving target, and my thoughts are being shaped, and even assumptions I had are being shaped. So if anything, I feel like my agenda's decreased, but my curiosity's increased, and my want to give more just like a practical structure to things, like how we approach interviewing guests and maybe some of the topics we want to make sure and how we do our critical part, or those sorts of things have become more important.
I mean, you and I had been talking about a podcast idea kind of very broadly before this project came to be specifically. But I think just the nature of our arrangement and how we negotiate tasks and things like that, and the fact that this started from a contract or an agreement I had with ASU. So anyway, all of that to say that, I mean, you've had to kind of naturally absorb some of my agenda just because that's, where, how these 2 seasons have been shaped so far. I mean, that's not to say that would always be the case, but I do feel like sometimes I push for more criticism, and you would you have a more open, curious mind than I do.
But I think that was our understanding going in, and that was kind of the point of having us both, is I was also critical, but I had a little bit more of an openness and perhaps more of just anxiety in general about, do we want to? But to be honest too, and I think just from a more selfish perspective, that leadership or that sense of you pushing me a little bit and you was kind of interest to me, was kind of like in what I wanted out of it. Also, I have a 3-year-old. I have, certain things that consume me in a way that I knew that I couldn't do justice to certain aspects of this, that you have the skills and the ability to do. And I've learned so much. Like, I love it.
I think I have a sense now of where you're going to come up against some of your boundaries, or like, okay, Jen, you've gone way out in left field here. Like, let's talk about this. And so I have a sense of that. And I think you have a sense too of where I've maybe just been, throwing some stuff against the wall, trying to see if this works, trying to see if this fits. And like, I feel like you're holding a certain end and I'm holding a certain end, and we meet kind of in the middle. So it works really well. And I was pretty clear at the beginning that this couldn't just be me and my big mouth, holding forth about engagement, and that I needed another big mouth to come and join me. Your implementation experience brings a lens to this that I don't have, because I've been known more as a critic, and to whatever extent I have a reputation in this. I do feel like that for the benefit of the project and the benefit of our guests and our listeners, like just even these personas of light and dark kind of coming together, I think serves the project well.
There's certainly been a sort of way of working together that's developed, and it's come somewhat, I think, from actually talking more because of COVID. I think we would have tried to book more in-person appointments to do our work, and therefore not spoken as much in between, but the sort of ability to and I think that's immensely helped the kind of level of consideration that we can give to things. Because instead of saying, like, for this script, you and I will sit down for an hour and we'll work it out and then it'll get done, whatever that is, there wouldn't be as many iterations. And I think it's certainly been beneficial for my thinking, let alone, I think, for if people saw the scripts when they started versus when we actually, like, they heard them, I think there's quite a big difference. And that comes from the fact that we probably talked through it, like, quite a good deal.
And one thing I was going to comment on, something you said earlier, I think, listeners who maybe enjoy the podcast, in the context of all the other podcasts they listen to and just sort of comes and goes, like, they're probably not thinking too deeply about all the work that we put into it. But I think what might surprise listeners is just how much writing work there is with this project, that I think of it primarily as a writing task. And that may just be because the production stuff comes naturally to, like, it's part of my professional work too. So I don't have to outsource it. I just do it myself. It's just piecing the things together. But it's the writing and the thing, which of course is also thinking. It's, in my mind, writing is thinking in action. And so you and I go through a lot of iterations of the script and kind of negotiating or navigating what we're going to include, what not to include, what's too much, what's too little. Do we need to do a deeper dive conceptually into something? Is this too much of a shorthand?
Yeah.
There's all of that. And I think it comes out in the writing, and it's, hopefully the episode itself sounds a little more easeful than that because we've done all that work up front.
I don't think I could have ever anticipated how intellectually heavy this project would be, because initially I did think that it would probably be more like an interview, and then we might write we thought we'd write like a sort of blog to go with it, right? We thought we'd have like a research paper or something. We talk to the person about it, and then there'd be a blog to go with it and maybe summarize it. And so in my head, that's pretty straightforward. And then we got to the point where we were really just listening to the interview first and trying to pull out what the episode was. And then you would do the first draft, and then we would work on it together. And this kind of thinking is what I needed to do, let alone wanted to do the work I do in the implementation stuff. I mean, the amount of writing you do for this, I can't imagine how exhausting that is, because, like, the thought that takes, let alone then my editing with you and working through I didn't expect it to be so sort of mentally consuming.
Yeah, the writing part, I mean, similar to the production stuff, I mean, people would know, I do a lot of writing typically and have done so in the past. And part of the challenge for me has been trying to find a writing voice that is a voice. So speaking words is very different than writing an essay. And then also, trying to figure out where you and I start and stop. And, there is some degree of, like, we might agree on a point, but it makes more sense for me to say it or for you to say it. So then we're trying to figure out, like, what would Emily say and what would Jen say? Mm-hmm. And so there is this piece of performance and putting together a production or a package that makes our point, but, without being inauthentic. And so there's, a lot of navigating of that. So that's a piece I've been learning as we go, for sure. And also learning to let things go, like, just, put it out and see what the world thinks and carry on. And we can't be perfectionists because we'll never get anything done. Mm-hmm. Even though I have to say that each one of our episodes feels like, you and I are putting together an hour-long conference presentation every single time, and submitting a paper to go with it. So
That's what it feels like.
I know. So it makes a lot of sense to me that it's all-consuming. And then we're also trying to string together concepts and episodes and build on themes. And we haven't talked about this a lot, actually, but it sort of comes out when we figure out what episode is coming next and how are we stringing together various episodes. Like, we know that there's a thread that we're trying to build on, and that if our listeners are following us from the beginning, what have we done so far that kind of primes people to think about this topic? And are we ready yet? And are there things that might be, too out there to bring forward yet when we haven't really done some of the foundational stuff? And, so our interests often range very widely, but we have to, at some point, just put out an episode.
Exactly.
So learning to just let go of perfection. And also, this came up this comes up in every episode where we're trying to decide how much of a point are we wanting to make, or how many points are we going to make about this? And does it always just come back to, what's the purpose of engagement? Why are we doing this? It does. It always comes back to the same fundamental questions. And so then I think, well, so should we just never talk about that because that's what everything is about?
Or should we only talk about that? Because I sometimes feel like that. I'm like, should that always be our first question? Like, what do you think this is all about? But I think there's, in terms of like this, what this is, like discussing it, this is also what's so good about this process, is this kind of constant it's like there's the reflecting on the podcast, there's the reflecting on the episode, and this has been such a big part of it for me, at least in terms of doing the podcast, is this kind of progressive sense of like what it is that we want to do with it. And I find that aspect of the work really, really interesting too. I don't know exactly out of this recording what we should put in, but we should definitely call it Letting Go of Perfection.
Oh my God, that's so nice. #blessed.
Well, you said it. I was like, you said it, and I'm like, oh, that's a hashtag right there.
And that's it. Thanks for listening. If you have any suggestions or comments, please get in touch at mattersofengagement.com. This episode was written and produced by Jennifer Johannesson and Emily Nicholas Engel, with generous financial contribution from the Ontario Spore Support Unit, or OSU, which is jointly funded by the Government of Ontario and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, or CIHR. The views and opinions expressed in this episode belong solely to the producers or their guests and are not to be considered endorsed by OSU, the Government of Ontario, or CIHR.